Christmas Eve, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. The town is surrounded. Inside the perimeter, a few men of the 101st Airborne Division decide they have earned one small mercy after a week of freezing: a fire. They gather around the flames in the dark, hands out, shoulders touching. Major Dick Winters described what happened next. The Germans picked it up and fired a mortar round. One round. It burst among the circle of men and put a lieutenant on the ground, badly wounded. Think about the speed of that. A flicker of light appears in the night, and within moments a German crew somewhere out in the frozen dark has laid its tube, dropped a bomb, and hit a target the size of a dinner table. Now here is what the crew did not know. The moment that round left the barrel, a clock started running. And it was not running for the Americans. All along the Western Front that winter, German mortar crews were being found in situations where being found should have been impossible. They fired from behind ridges where no observer could see them. They fired at night when the little American spotter planes, the ones every German gunner had learned to dread, could not fly. They fired in fog, in snowfall, in total blackout, at targets as innocent-looking as a warming fire behind the American line. Then they packed up, exactly as their manuals demanded, and moved, and the shells still found the ground they had just been standing on. Nothing in a German crew's training, nothing in 5 years of war could account for it. Their entire craft rested on one assumption as old as gunpowder. To be shot at, you must first be seen. Behind a hill, at night, in fog, you cannot be seen. So how were they being hunted? The answer existed. It simply lived outside everything those men had been taught about how a battlefield sees. The thing hunting them was not a machine they could capture, nor a spy they could catch, and no light they could douse would switch it off. It was a sound their own weapon made with every shot, a deep push of air at the very bottom edge of human hearing, more felt than heard. The Allies had learned not only to catch that sound, but to turn it into map coordinates, good to a few dozen yards, in minutes, which means those campfires were never quite what they appeared to be. Whether the men warming their hands knew it or not, lights like that one were now wired, through physics, through mathematics, through 30 years of stubborn, unglamorous work, into a hidden network of instruments buried in the frozen ground, and into quiet rooms full of moving paper and fine string. The light asked a question. The German answer gave everything away. To understand how a campfire can kill the man who shoots at it, we have to go back to 1915, to a 25-year-old physicist with a Nobel Prize already on his shelf, to a discovery he made, of all places, in a toilet on the Western Front, and to a sound below the floor of hearing, a sound that would spend 3 decades waiting for its moment, and then, in one frozen winter, collect the debt. Part 1. The sound below hearing. Here is something worth sitting with for a second. By 1915, the deadliest weapon on Earth had become, for all practical purposes, invisible. Artillery was doing most of the killing in the Great War, and artillery had learned to hide. Guns pulled back behind hills and woods out of sight of every trench periscope and every observer on every rooftop. You could hear them murder your battalion all day. You could not point at them on a map. And a gun you cannot point at is a gun you cannot silence. Every army tried the obvious fix. Watch for the muzzle flash, start a stopwatch. Wait for the bang, multiply by the speed of sound. It failed for a reason that tells you everything about what came later. At a distance, a heavy gun does not go crack. It goes rumble, a long, smeared growl with no clean beginning. 2 men with 2 stopwatches would disagree by half a second, and half a second of sound is 170 meters of error. You ended up shelling an empty field while the real battery kept working. Into this problem, in the middle of 1915, the British Army dropped a young territorial officer of the Horse Artillery named William Lawrence Bragg. Bragg was 25 years old, and that same year he became, and still remains, the youngest science Nobel laureate in history, sharing the physics prize with his own father while serving at the front. The Army handed the newest Nobel winner on the planet a problem every general considered hopeless: find the guns we cannot see. Bragg started by noticing something strange about what a cannon actually sounds like. When a shell passes overhead faster than sound, it drags a sharp, screaming crack along with it. Loud, obvious, useless, because it tells you about the shell's path, not the gun's position. But underneath that scream, arriving on its own schedule, comes the gun's true report. A deep, heavy pulse of air, down around 20 cycles per second, at the absolute floor of what a human ear can register. Less a noise than a shove. Bragg did. and the story of Howe has been told and retold for a century. He is said to have first sensed the deep gun wave while sitting in the latrine at his billet, where each distant shot arrived as a distinct little push of pressure against his body. One of the pivotal military discoveries of the 20th century, made by a Nobel laureate in an outhouse. Hold on to that number, 20 cycles per second. That frequency, that unhearable shove of air, is the reason a warming fire in Belgium in 1944 could function as a piece of bait, whether any American intended it to or not. We will meet it again. Bragg's insight created a new problem. How do you catch a sound no ear can hear? The answer came from the most improbable direction imaginable. A lance corporal named William Tucker, a middle-aged private soldier doing odd jobs for a searchlight unit, turned out, when someone finally asked, to be a physicist and a lecturer in acoustics at Imperial College London. Remember that. One of the decisive instruments of 2 world wars was invented by a man the army had filed under general duties. Tucker built a microphone that was almost embarrassingly simple, a thin platinum wire heated by a small current stretched across the mouth of a container. Early versions were housed in ordinary ammunition boxes. The shriek of a passing shell barely touched it. But when the deep gun wave rolled through, that slow push of cool air chilled the wire. Its electrical resistance twitched, and the instrument registered a clean, unmistakable blip. Tucker's wire was deaf to everything except the one sound that mattered. Now string 5 or 6 of those boxes in a line across several miles of ground, each one's position surveyed with obsessive precision. Run wires from every microphone back to a recorder adapted from a French film device, where each instrument draws its own line on moving photographic film stamped with time marks. A German battery fires. The gun wave rolls outward like a ripple on a pond, reaching the nearest microphone first, the next one a fraction later, the far one later still. And each arrival puts a visible break in that instrument's line on the film. Those tiny time differences, raised to 100th of a second, are the whole secret. Run the ripple backward and the arcs cross at one point on the map. That point is the gun. By 1917, the technique was maturing fast. At Vimy Ridge that April, Canadian gunners working with Bragg's methods went into battle with, by some accounts, more than 4 out of 5 German batteries already fixed on the map before the first soldier climbed out of his trench. In 1918, the listening war helped break the German artillery arm wholesale. The Americans, late to the war, took to it with a convert's enthusiasm. Army records credit one American ranging outfit with fixing 117 German gun positions in a single 24-hour stretch. Understand what had quietly changed. Every buried microphone on the front was a promise. Make this sound, and we will find you. Not we might see you. Not if the weather holds. A promise written in physics. Darkness could not blind it, fog could not blur it, and a hill was no obstacle at all because pressure waves roll straight over hills. In 1918, the promise applied to cannon. And for the next 25 years, one weapon, small, cheap, carried on men's backs, beloved by the German infantry above almost everything else in its arsenal, lived comfortably outside it. After the armistice, nobody abandoned the technique. The British kept it. The French kept it, and the Germans, who had experimented with acoustic location since before 1914, built it into their army wholesale. Entire observation battalions, each with a survey battery, a flash spotting battery, and a sound ranging battery, marching into Poland and France in 1939. That is the paradox this whole story hangs on. The men of 1944 belonged to an army that understood location by sound perfectly well. The trap that killed them was not a secret weapon. What was secret was something far stranger. The loophole their favorite weapon had lived inside since 1918, the loophole every crew's sense of safety was built on, had just been quietly welded shut, and no one had told them. What was it? It comes down to 4,000 meters and a line of wire buried in the wrong place. Part 2. The loophole. By the time American troops went ashore in North Africa in November 1942, the United States Army had turned the listening war into an institution. It built specialist units called Field Artillery Observation Battalions, outfits of surveyors, mathematicians, and instrument men whose entire purpose was finding enemy guns by their sound and their muzzle flash. There would be 25 of these battalions by the end of the war, and they took part in nearly every battle the Army fought after that first November. One of them, the 1st Observation Battalion, would eventually be credited with more than 900 days in the line, by some accounts, more combat time than any other American unit of the war. And behind those listeners stood the thing that made American ears uniquely dangerous. The Fire Direction Center, born at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the same unglamorous schoolhouse revolution this channel has explored before. Other armies could locate a target. The Americans could locate it and have massed shells falling on the coordinates within minutes, from guns spread across miles, all coordinated through a single room. One man shows what this meant. Lieutenant David Whipp of the 1st Observation Battalion was not a trained gunner at all. He was a survey officer, a man of theodolites and benchmarks. In March 1943, at El Guitar, in Tunisia, his citation records that he went forward ahead of the infantry under German shell fire and laid the survey control for the entire attacking artillery 2 days before the guns even arrived. A month later, manning a forward observation post that was itself being shelled, he spotted a German battery in action. He was not qualified to direct fire. He picked up the radio and called the Corps Fire Direction Center anyway. The result, per the records, that battery and others near it, the better part of a battalion of German artillery, neutralized. A surveyor with a radio had just erased more firepower than most infantry companies would destroy in the whole war. Keep that radio call in mind. The gap between detecting a target and shells landing on it is about to matter more than any gun on the front. Because an uncomfortable truth was hiding under all this Allied brilliance. The entire magnificent apparatus had one blind spot, and the German infantry had spent years learning to live inside it. The deep gun wave from a heavy cannon rolls out for 15 kilometers or more, plenty of reach for microphones sighted safely behind the lines. But a mortar is not a cannon. An 81mm tube fires a small charge from a short barrel, and its report carries only about 4,000 meters before it fades into the noise of the battlefield. The big 120mm version manages 6,000 or so. Meanwhile, the classic microphone base sat 3 to 5 kilometers behind the forward positions. Perfect geometry for catching guns barking from deep in the enemy rear, and almost completely deaf to a tube coughing quietly from just over the next ridge. Add everything else the weapon offered. It dropped its bombs in a high, steep arc, so it could hide directly behind a reverse slope where no line of sight on Earth could reach it. Its muzzle flash was a flicker, not a lighthouse. Its crew was a handful of men who could fire a mission and then carry the entire weapon away on their backs before anyone finished asking where the rounds had come from. Flash spotters could not see it. Long microphone bases could not hear it. Spotter planes had to catch it in the act. The Germans understood this arithmetic with total clarity, and they bet their defense of Europe on it. Their artillery arm was starved and mismatched. The general commanding 5th Panzer Army in Normandy wrote that his batteries included guns from every major power in Europe, a museum of captured calibers with a logistics nightmare attached, and by one estimate his guns could fire about 1/10 of the ammunition the British opposite him were firing. Horses still pulled much of what the Wehrmacht owned. So the Germans compensated with the one indirect fire weapon that was cheap, portable, and, crucially, unfindable. A single German infantry division carried 57 of the 81mm tubes and up to 20 of the heavy 120s. Facing the British sector, rocket launcher regiments, 54 multi-barreled Nebelwerfers each, stood at a scale of roughly 1 regiment per division. Normandy showed what that bet was worth. By late July 1944, operational researchers concluded that around 70% of British and Canadian infantry casualties in the campaign came from mortar and Nebelwerfer fire. 70%. American studies of their own sectors put the figure as high as 3/4. Not tanks, not the famous machine guns. The quiet tube behind the hill was, by the numbers, the deadliest thing the German army owned. And notice the strange double standard that ruled the battlefield by day. The little American spotter planes, Piper Cubs droning slowly along the front, had taught German gun batteries a reflex of pure fear. When a plane was up, the guns held their breath. Observers in more than one theater recorded enemy batteries staying silent for hours, risking a few rounds only at dawn and dusk. The crews behind the ridges never learned that fear. They had never needed to. For 5 years, no bill had ever arrived for anything they fired. In that world, a warming fire behind the American line meant exactly what it seemed to mean: free meat. A light in the dark was a gift, a target you could service in 60 seconds at zero risk. The Americans learned the economics from the receiving end. Infantrymen dug exhaust channels to lead smoke away from their fires. Cooks hung tarpaulins over field stoves to break up the plume. An entire etiquette of darkness and smokelessness grew up in the line companies, because every soldier knew in his bones what light and smoke bought: incoming. Nobody around those fires suspected that the ledger was about to flip, that within months the safest shot in the German arsenal would become the most expensive, and that the light a crew fired at would matter far less than the sound the crew made by firing. Men like David Whipp never made the newsreels. They made the newsreels possible. A surveyor crawling ahead of the infantry so that the mathematics behind him would hold true. If you believe that kind of work deserves to outlive the men who did it, the like button is one small way to keep their story in front of people who still care. It costs you nothing. It costs them rather more. Part 3. 90 days to close a loophole. In the summer of 1944, in the middle of the Normandy bloodletting, a scientist attached to the British 21st Army Group sat down with the casualty returns and wrote a sentence that should never have been necessary 5 years into a world war. In the British Army, he noted, there existed, at present, no official organization for counter-mortar work. None. Each division was improvising its own answer to the weapon causing 7 out of 10 of its infantry casualties. His research found something worse. Divisional staffs were systematically underestimating how many tubes were even facing them. That memo marks the turn. What happened over the following weeks was one of those rare moments when an army, mid-battle, changes the physics of the problem instead of throwing more men at it. The fix came in 3 layers, and each layer removed one pillar of the German crew's safety. The first layer was a new kind of recorder. The old film apparatus had to be chemically developed before anyone could read it. Minutes lost in a dark room while the enemy displaced. The replacement rushed to Italy and Normandy for trials in June and July 1944, drew its traces with 4 electric pens on a moving strip of sensitized paper. No film, no developing. The moment the pens twitched, the trace could be read, measured, converted. The listening war had just gone from photography to live broadcast. The second layer was geometry, and this is the piece that revoked the loophole directly. If a tube's report only carries 4 kilometers, then the microphones must live inside those 4 kilometers. So the new bases were shrunk and shoved forward, 4 instruments in shallow pits, each covered with a windshield to strip away the rustle of weather, spaced 600 to 800 meters apart, the whole line barely a mile long and sighted close behind the forward foxholes. Every pit was surveyed to hair-fine precision, and far out in front of the line of pits sat a listening post whose occupant had one of the strangest jobs of the war. Wait in the dark, and when you hear a cough from the German side, press the switch that wakes the pens. The third layer, nobody saw coming. In 1944, radar crews experimenting along the front discovered something with a beautiful twist buried inside it. Radar could track a shell in flight, but a cannon shell's long, flat arc gave the mathematics nothing to grip. The trajectory could not be solved backward. A mortar bomb was different. It climbs in a high, steep, almost textbook parabola, and a parabola is the one curve a plotting team can run backward with confidence. Track the bomb on its way up, extend the curve down, and the answer lands on the base plate. Anti-aircraft sets were turned around to look down instead of up, and the best of them, the American-built SCR-584, began producing locations accurate to about 25 yards. Appreciate the irony? The Germans never got the chance to. The one weapon that had been immune to every locating technology of the war turned out to be the only weapon the newest technology could catch. Its signature virtue, that high, hill-hopping arc, was precisely what betrayed it to the mathematics. Around the instruments grew an organization built for one purpose: speed. Divisions stood up dedicated counter-mortar staffs, and by late 1944, full counter-mortar batteries were forming, pairing the radar sets with the forward pen recorder bases. A battery of guns was commonly held on call for them, so the reply left the barrels within minutes of the pens twitching. The reply itself was chosen with cold intelligence. A mortar is a steel pipe on a steel plate. You can bracket it with shells all afternoon and bend nothing, so the doctrine did not aim at the pipe. Shells were fused to burst in the air directly above the pit, spraying fragments straight down into the one component no factory could replace: the crew. High-velocity anti-aircraft guns, with their crisp airburst fuses, became a favorite instrument for the job. The SCR-584 came off American production lines, and radar ranging would soon sit in the U.S. Observation Battalion's own manual beside sound and flash. Now put the pieces together. From roughly 90 days after D-Day, a German crew that fired at anything from anywhere within reach of a forward base or a radar set was handing the Allies its exact address. Darkness changed nothing. Pens do not need light. Fog changed nothing. A pressure wave does not care about visibility, and neither does radar beam. The reverse slope, the crew's oldest friend, was no obstacle to a sound rolling over the crest, or a parabola climbing above it, which transformed the meaning of everything visible on the American side of the line. A truck on a road, a lit window, a careless fire. None of these could any longer be just a target. Each one had become, functionally, a question addressed to every German tube within range. Are you there? Answer, and the instruments take your statement. Were fires ever set deliberately as bait? Deception was a full-blown Allied industry by 1944. The British had famously built entire fake burning cities, decoy fire sites that soaked up, by one estimate, nearly 1,000 tons of German bombs meant for real towns. Fake positions, decoy lights, dummy flashes were standard tools. But the honest and more unsettling answer is this. The fire did not need to be a trick to work like one. Whether a deception officer placed it or a frozen rifleman lit it against orders, the arithmetic downstream was identical. The light provokes the shot betrays the shooter. Intent had become irrelevant. The trap was now built into the physics of the front itself. This new machine assumed one thing, though, that the front would hold still long enough for the instruments to do their listening. On the morning of December 16th, 1944, the front stopped holding still. 1,600 German guns opened fire at once through fog that grounded every spotter plane on the Western Front, and a truck column of American listeners found itself driving down the wrong road, at the wrong hour, toward a crossroads called Bonnier. Part 4. The Winter of Wrong Assumptions. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes front dissolved into noise. 1,600 German guns and rocket launchers fired for 90 minutes along an 80-mile line, the opening blow of Hitler's last great gamble in the West. Buried inside that thunder was an accidental stroke of genius. Acoustic location has one classic weakness. When hundreds of guns fire at once, the traces pile onto each other and the pens drown. The German army had opened its offensive with the single sound its enemy's ears handled worst, under a sky so choked with fog and snow that every Allied spotter plane sat pinned to the ground. For the men planning the attack, that fog was the whole point. Their experience of American firepower was an experience of being seen. By planes, by observers on ridgelines. Kill the seeing, their logic ran. And you kill the guns. For about 2 days, the front seemed to prove them right. Then, at a lonely crossroads, the war reached out and touched the listeners themselves. On December 17th, a convoy of Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, sound and flashmen, the ears of an American corps, was driving south from the Aachen area toward the fighting. At the hamlet of Bonnier, near the town of Malmedy, their thin-skinned trucks ran head-on into the armored spearhead of SS officer Joachim Peiper. The fight lasted minutes before the outgunned Americans surrendered. Roughly 150 prisoners, most of them from the 285th, were herded into a snowy field beside the crossroads. Then the main SS column came up, and the machine guns opened fire on the prisoners. At least 84 American soldiers were murdered in that field. The survivors lived by falling with the dead and lying motionless in the snow, some for hours, faces down, listening to single pistol shots as SS men walked the rows finishing the wounded. First Lieutenant Virgil Larry of Battery B was one of the men who crawled out of that field alive. In 1946, he stood in a courtroom at Dachau and pointed out the SS soldier who had fired the first shot. There's a terrible symmetry here. Of all the units chance could have parked at that crossroads, it delivered a battalion of listeners, men whose weapons were theodolites, stopwatches, and rolls of moving paper. The massacre at Malmedy became one of the most infamous war crimes of the Western War, and word of it ran through the American lines by nightfall, hardening the fighting to come. But it did not silence what those men were part of. You can murder operators. An idea redeploys, and the idea was about to have the best 2 weeks of its existence, precisely because of the weather the Germans thought was protecting them. Fog grounds a Piper Cub. Fog does nothing whatsoever to a pressure wave rolling through the air at 20 cycles per second, and nothing to a radar beam tracing a bomb's climb. Night had been the tube crew's kingdom since 1939. Night was now the cleanest hunting time the instruments ever got, because friendly guns fired less after dark, and the traces came through uncluttered. Every condition the attacking Germans read as blindness, the instruments read as clarity. On the northern shoulder of the bulge, ground this channel has walked before, where massed battalions broke the 12th SS in the snow, Some 348 guns, plus a battalion of heavy 4.2-inch mortars, were lashed together under a single coordinating headquarters. And from December 21st, the shells themselves changed. The new proximity fuses, finally released for ground combat, burst rounds automatically at the deadliest height above whatever lay beneath. Hold that image against the doctrine you met a few minutes ago. The countercrew method already wanted airbursts over the pits. Now the airburst aimed itself. So put yourself, honestly, inside the head of a German crew leader that winter, a competent, experienced soldier doing everything right. Your manual is clear, and your manual has always been correct. Fire the mission, break the weapon down, displace within minutes, and no counterfire on Earth can beat you to the spot. That doctrine was written against the enemy of 1940. And against the enemy of 1943 it still held. What you cannot know is that the numbers underneath it have been quietly repealed. You are now being logged. Every pit you fire from goes onto a hostile locations list, cross-filed with map references and calibers. The enemy keeps biographies of your firing presiding on 5 years of experience. That was safe to answer. If your father, grandfather, or uncle served in an observation battalion, a counter-mortar section, or on the guns that answered those calls, I would be honored to read their story in the comments. What unit? What did they tell you about the listening war? The details families carry are often the only record of it left anywhere. One question remains, the one the whole title hangs on. If the light never gave a single position away, if it was always the sound, then what exactly were those fires in the cold accounting of that winter? The verdict has to answer that. And it ends where we began, with a circle of freezing men at Bastogne on Christmas Eve. Part 5. The verdict. The fire was only the question. First, the scale, because the numbers refused to let this stay a curiosity. In the second half of the war, in Italy and Northwest Europe alone, British and Commonwealth sound bases produced 15,777 hostile battery locations. The flash spotting posts added over 4,000 more. On the American side, 25 observation battalions were in the field by the end, threaded through nearly every operation from Tunisia to the Elbe. A typical Allied counter-battery cycle. First enemy round fired, location computed, reply dispatched, ran 12 to 15 minutes and sometimes less. Field Marshal Rommel, watching from the other side in Italy, wrote it down himself. The enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery has broken the front open. And George Patton, a man never accused of undervaluing tanks, told his officers after the victory that they hardly needed him to say who had won the war. The artillery did. But the deepest measure of what the listening war achieved is not a count of anything destroyed. It is the silence. By the last year, German gun batteries across the Western Front had been taught, position by position, funeral by funeral, that to speak was to die. So they mostly stopped speaking. A few furtive rounds at dawn and dusk, then stillness. Think about what that means. Thousands of intact, loaded, crude German artillery pieces, defeated without being touched because the cost of using them had been made unpayable. The tube crews were simply the last members of the German fire arsenal to receive the same lesson, and they received it in the dark, without ever being shown the teacher. So let's pay off the title in plain words. The Campfires never exposed a single German position. Not one. A flame cannot see, and the crews had the physics of light exactly right. Behind a ridge, at night, in positions. Maybe the first reply misses you because you moved fast. The position stays on file anyway. Fire from it again next week, and usable ground behind any ridge is finite, and the response arrives pre-computed, bursting in the air over your head. Now ask, what does this feel like from below? It feels like nothing you can learn from. Sometimes you fire and nothing happens. Sometimes you fire and the sky detonates over your position within minutes. Same drill, same care, opposite outcomes. Men facing lethal consequences with no visible cause do not conclude, the enemy has rewritten physics. They conclude bad luck. They conclude betrayal. They start moving constantly. And the record shows exactly that. Allied reporting procedures came to treat a tube location as stale news almost on arrival, because the crews shifted so often. German gun batteries took up roving tactics, firing from temporary scrapes, risking rounds only during lulls in Allied fire. That behavior is testimony. It is what an army does when it can feel a noose it cannot see. And they could not see it because, for the first time in the history of target hunting, there was nothing to see. A proximity fuse could be captured in a dud shell and reverse engineered. A radar transmits, and transmissions can be detected and hunted. But a buried microphone emits nothing, and a pressure wave cannot be jammed. The plot was pencil lines and stretched string in a room miles away. The whole detector had no signature, it made no sound of its own, gave off no light or radiation, and offered nothing a patrol could stumble over and understand. German intelligence could have captured every component and still not seen the network behind it. One more cruelty completed the cage. The German army's own listening battalions had withered with everything else, and its gun batteries had already been schooled into silence. Firing in daylight invited annihilation, so they mostly held their tongues. An artillery arm that dares not speak cannot fight counter-battery duels. And it also cannot run the experiments that would teach its infantry what exactly keeps finding the tubes. The knowledge existed in fragments across the German war machine. It never assembled itself in time to reach a crew leader shivering behind a ridge in Belgium, watching a small light flicker on the American side and dog. Nothing visual could touch them. Their mistake was defending against the wrong sense. What the fires did was provoke. They put an irresistible reason to shoot in front of men whose weapon had been free to shoot for 5 years, and the shot did the rest. The report of their own tube, that deep, unhearable shove of air Lawrence Bragg first felt in a latrine in 1915, rolled out across the snow to instruments buried in pits a few thousand meters away. Pens twitched on moving paper, strings crossed on a plotting board, and a battery that had been waiting for precisely this took down the coordinates and answered. It was not the light that betrayed them. It was the sound of their own answer to the light. One sentence closes the whole ledger. If those same crews, making those same decisions, had faced the Allied army of 1943, the fire would have been exactly what it appeared to be: free meat, a target at zero cost. They were not facing the army of 1943. The trap looked identical before and after it was armed. That is the entire story, and it is why no crew could reason its way to the truth. Every explanation available to them was visual, and every visual check they ran came back clean. No aircraft overhead, no observer on any hill. Every line of sight accounted for. When death follows action invisibly and inconsistently, men do not conclude that the battlefield has grown a new sense. They conclude luck or treachery. The real answer was never hidden from them. It was simply unimaginable to them. Which brings us back, at last, to Christmas Eve in Bastogne. A ring of exhausted paratroopers around a small fire, taking the one comfort available in a surrounded town. A single German round arriving out of the dark with vicious speed, and a lieutenant going down in the snow. History does not record what happened afterward to the crew that fired it. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps, minutes later, pens moved on a strip of paper in a dim room, and the night answered back. What history does record is which army kept lighting fires that winter, and which army was learning, tube by tube and grave by grave, to be terrified of its own trigger. For most of human history, war was a contest of eyes. Scouts, watchtowers, balloons, periscopes, aircraft, 5,000 years of one assumption. To kill it, first see it. The winter of 1944 is the moment the battlefield grew a second sense, and everything since descends from it. Modern counter-battery radar that answers in seconds. Acoustic and seismic arrays scattered across today's front lines. The iron rule taught to every artilleryman alive: shoot and move or die. All of it traces back through those pits in Belgium to a hot platinum wire in an ammunition box, and to a young physicist's absurd, undignified moment of insight in a frontline latrine. The German crews of that winter were not fools. They were early. They stood on the exact seam between two ages of warfare, and the seam ran directly through their firing pits. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It helps this story reach people who care about getting history right, not just getting it loud. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, and carry this away with you. On a modern battlefield, the most dangerous act is to announce yourself. And every weapon, sooner or later, announces itself. The men who understood that first did not carry rifles. They carried stopwatches, string, surveying instruments, and rolls of moving paper. Bragg, Tucker, Whip, Larry, 84 men lying silent in a snowy field at Baugny. They had names, and they deserved to be remembered by them.